welcome Rich Ivry here for the distinguished lecture today. And it's really a pleasure because he's been involved in so many different aspects of research that are relevant to many of us here. I think he's especially well known for his work that's, I would say, it's kind of at the interface between the cognitive world and the motor world. So it's really looking at both aspects. And he's made major contributions to our understanding of cerebellar function, to motor learning, to aspects of decision making as well. And I could go on and on. I just want to tell you briefly a little bit about his background and throw in this little anecdote in there. So Rich did his undergrad training at Brown University before going to Oregon to do his PhD. And then from there, he's been at Berkeley actually for most of his career. And the anecdote is that the last time I went to Berkeley to visit Rich, he said to me, "So Robert, I have a bone to pick with you." And I thought, uh-oh, did I fail to cite an important paper of his in one of my studies or something? And he said, no. He says, "I really think I deserved an A on that assignment." And I was like, what are you talking about? But so it turns out that Rich was in a course that I was a TA for at Brown. And I, of course, didn't really remember this. But considering that none of the other students in that course became professors at Berkeley, I think probably you deserved that A.
Two others in that class got A's and are professors,
yeah.
Hal Pashler and Michael Moser. So.
I can take any credit. Probably not. And the other thing I just wanted to mention, that among all the very important contributions Rich has made scientifically, he's also made a very important contribution in terms of being one of the main editors at the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience. And I just want to highlight this because he's one of those rare editors who actually gives you advice as an author, so you don't just get a form letter as many of us are so used to getting, but Rich is someone who will actually interpret the reviews for you and give you advice about how to proceed and so forth. So I'd suggest we all send papers to him.
Well, welcome them.
Although I think it's after, what, 11 or 12 years you're trying to get out of this?
Yeah, I am trying to back off on that, yes.
Anyway, welcome, and we're very much looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you. The class was Psychology 152, Human Information Processing. I do not remember every class I took at Brown, but that class, every student who took it remembers that class because it had something ridiculous, like you had to do 3 lab reports, each 20 pages in length. Now I'm sure there's not a single class at Berkeley that you probably write 60 or 70 pages in one semester. Maybe they do that at McGill, but in our department, you're lucky if the students are writing 3 pages. But there they had 70 pages in the writing there. And I was happy to get away with that B, actually, in that class. OK, I got to position myself, because you have a very bright light. That's up this way. So I put my acknowledgements on the front page here. One is a highlight that, indeed, I think our work always has been sort of this intersection of cognition and action. And so we put that into our lab name after actually many lab meetings so that we could come up with the perfect acronym, which has been stolen by about 10 labs since then. The work today involves former members and current members of the lab. Jordan Taylor contributed to, there's really 2 halves here, and he contributed to both halves. He's running his own lab at Princeton now. Sam McDougall's a graduate student there that we kind of co-advise. And Ryan Moorhead finished up at Berkeley and is now doing a postdoc at Harvard. And these are some current characters in the lab. And again, there's 2 different parts here that I want to talk about, but they both center on this theme about this intersection or interaction. Systems interaction is, I believe, what I've called the title. Here's actually, people have long thought about in skill acquisition about different stages, about interaction between cognition and action systems. This slide, if you go to the motor control conferences, you've probably seen this before. It's really a great one. It shows over the last 100 years, the world record in the high jump. And so you can see people, of course, if it's a world record, it has to be a rising bar, so to speak. We've gone from 6 feet, now we're approaching 8 feet. But you do have these beautiful stages here where, people are piddling around. Someone comes up with the idea to do this Western roll. I don't know what a Western roll is. But in here, we got this person who came up with this breakthrough to do the parallel straddle, and that raised the bar. This is when the jump was first introduced, and then basically everyone becomes parallel straddlers until Dick Fosbury, a University of Oregon person, comes along and decides, let's go over the bar backwards, which no one had ever done before, mainly because they didn't have soft landing pits, which is why they didn't. So technology always drives innovation here. Goes over the bar backwards. That moves him from being a good jumper to an Olympic quality jumper. But very quickly, he's left in the dust because everyone else comes along, does the Fosbury flop, and raises things along. We've kind of been stuck now. We're kind of waiting for the next aha moment to move us on to the next stage there. So in terms of stages of skill acquisition, we've had this sort of classic model about that. Early on, we're kind of trying to figure out the task. It's been described by Fitz and Posner in their classic work as sort of the cognitive stage, associative stage. We're kind of figuring out the different parts. And then we spend a lot of time in this autonomous stage mastering things. But again, when they have this sort of model, they're talking about this sort of transition from the cognition or the interplay from the cognitive into the more motoric, extending over a long period of skill acquisition. I'm going to be talking about it more in terms of a more immediate task. That is when we're doing a simple action or learning a new skill about how these different processes might interact. And so for skill acquisition, we might think about something like if we learn to play basketball. That's certainly a skill. And here's a couple people who have mastered the skill. And I now have to actually update the slide since the Warriors traded David Lee a year ago. But now if I've learned to play basketball and like my kids are growing up and we decide to raise the backboard in the driveway, right? We think of that more as adaptation, right? I'm not really learning a new skill. I'm taking an existing skill and I'm just kind of tweaking it a little bit, recalibrating it. Now if I go off to England, they have this strange sport over there where they play basketball-like sport, but they call it netball, first of all. And as far as I could tell, the main difference between the two is that they don't have a backboard, okay? So that's going to take away a lot of my repertoire if I've learned to play basketball. And so are we going to call that adaptation? Are we going to call that a strategy change, a skill change, right? You can sort of see that there's different things I have to solve to be able to move from being a basketball player to being a netball player. Well, I'm not going to study anything nearly that complex here. I'm going to go back to a very basic task. And this is going to be a very low technology talk, okay? And I even brought my low technology virtual reality world here, which many of you have probably seen, but now it's probably been lost in the literature. So these are prism glasses. So they're my virtual reality because it's going to displace the world. And I'm first going to demonstrate that give you a nice baseline. I'm a pretty skilled pointer, right? I can hit that almost every time, all right? Coordinated guy that I am. I put these on here, and I do the task, and I miss, right? So this is what you've seen here, but if I keep doing it over and over again, I gradually get pretty good at it, right? So I've now mastered this new skill, or at least mastered moving in this new environment. And what's always been amazing about these things is that I got myself really well calibrated, take off the glasses reach, and I have that after effect, okay? So I knew I took off those glasses. I've got over 50 years of experience at reaching here, but I was able to distort that and have this after effect there, right? So that's been a very popular task to study sensory motor learning, but I think, as many people would point out, probably it's a bit of an exaggeration to call it sensory motor learning. We should maybe call it something more modest like sensory motor adaptation. Kind of broke my glasses, but I'll deal with my props later on. Okay. We don't use the prism glasses. We use a slightly more advanced method, but not that much more advanced, where we're going to actually have people sitting at a table like this. Targets are going to be appearing at some position along the ring. Person's going to reach to the target. They don't see their hand. They're reaching underneath this mirrored surface and so forth, but they get a cursor that's projected where their finger is. And that provides a very compelling illusion. Very quickly, we think of that dot, that cursor, as our finger as we move it about. And the fun thing here is that we can then perturb that feedback. We can rotate it, and that's what we typically do, is rotate it 20 degrees or 45 degrees or whatever to introduce a perturbation such as with the prism glasses. And one thing about the rotations is it extends the learning period a little bit further than the 5 or 6 trials you might get with the prism glasses. And this has been a model task. This is one of a number of different sensory motor adaptation tasks that have been studied. I've had an interest in this because it provides this task to, first of all, look at this recalibration of the execution system, what I'm calling this sensory motor adaptation. It's always been thought to have any sort of minimal role of cognition or action selection. It's this idea that I'm not really learning a new skill. I'm taking an existing ability and retuning it. And it's been shown to be strongly dependent on the cerebellum. And again, the main evidence for that comes from patient studies. People have cerebellar degeneration, usually from some genetic disorder. They showed difficulty at mastering this task. And this is just one particular study. There's quite a few out there. This is the way the data are frequently plotted. Trial as we go across on the x-axis. Error here. There's first a baseline period before the perturbation is introduced, so you get a sense of motor variability. They introduced, I think it was a 22.5-degree perturbation here. And you can see over time, the control participants gradually reduce that error. Then when they turn off the perturbation, you have to see that reverse learning, what you saw with me with the mirror glasses, right? You see this so-called after effect. And this is just, again, one study. It's a bit more dramatic than you usually see. But these people with ataxia, with the cerebellar disorder, the coordination problems are described as ataxia, ataxic movements, a loss of coordination. And this is just showing that here you see very little change over the course of those 80 or so trials. When you turn off the perturbation, of course, they look better than the controls, but that's because they haven't adapted the system. They don't have to unlearn something. And again, there's many different examples of this showing that there seems to be a strong dependency of the cerebellum on the cerebellum for this form of learning to occur. And what's been interesting, again, this sort of a schematic, a simple schematic of the kind of role that the cerebellum is thought to play in this sort of task, or a general sort of picture about where the emphasis is in terms of thinking about the cerebellum. And one thing I want to really highlight here is that more recent theoretical work, or the past 10 years, I'd say, the emphasis has really been about that the cerebellum is involved in producing coordinated movements, but the central role, or at least the emphasis, has been about in terms of generating sensory predictions. So it's, again, movement in the act of trying to anticipate the sensory experiences that we're going to experience. And just to show sort of the general notion here, this idea about that the cerebellum is important for predictive control, we have this schematic where we have some sort of motor command that goes down the motor pathway, we produce some movement, we get some sensory consequence. So that's the actual feedback here. But the idea is that we also take that motor command and we send a copy of it to the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is going to produce these computations that are going to generate a prediction of the expected feedback. And so what we want to have here is a comparison between our prediction of the feedback and the actual feedback. And if there's a mismatch, we get this so-called sensory prediction error. And that's going to be used both for online control. So think about you're walking down the stairs, you're expecting a tread, the tread's not there. You get that sensory prediction error about expecting to experience the tread, it's not there. You can do this very rapid online correction to make an adjustment so hopefully you don't topple over. But it's also this idea that this is going to be important for learning. And the main emphasis, at least with respect to the cerebellum, is that that sensory prediction error is used to update this forward model so that in the future I'll make better predictions. For a given efference copy, I'll make a different prediction. Also, of course, we need to have something to change the motor behavior. I'm going to set that aside, but that would be the inverse model problem. So again, how does this sensory prediction error account for the behavior we see in these adaptation studies? Well, again, here's our baseline. Here's the behavior we typically observe, just plotted it the wrong direction. This is with a 45-degree rotation. Overreaches, you're getting better. So early in rotation, right, I'm aiming for this target. I reach towards the target, but because of that perturbation, the target ends up over there. So I've got this 45-degree error. That's that giant sensory prediction error. I use that to make the adjustment. So now when I see the target up there, my hand actually goes out in this direction here. But because I think I'm reaching towards the target, now the feedback I get is basically right where I expect it to have. So I have essentially very little sensory prediction error. And so now the system should become stable because now it's been recalibrated, right? So that's how adaptation's been thought to occur from sensory prediction error. But Zoni and Krakauer introduced a nice twist on this task here. They basically said, okay, we're going to use this action, so we're going to use this strategy task. They're going to cue a target, okay? And the person, remember, if we reach to it, we get this rotated feedback. But after they've done that for one trial, so here the person goes along, they introduce the perturbation, you have the 45-degree error. At that point, they said, oh, timeout, timeout. We forgot to tell you. We're actually going to rotate that feedback by 45 degrees. So what you need to do, if you want to be good at the task, is just aim one target over. Okay, so they gave them the strategy. They told them exactly what's going to be happening here. So the person's told, aim over there. If the target's here, aim one to the right. If the target's here, aim in the clockwise direction each time. And of course, ta-da, people are really smart, okay? You tell them to aim 45 degrees to the side. That's what they do. Boom, immediate learning. None of this slow, gradual learning. You get this one-shot learning. That wouldn't be that interesting. Well, what's interesting is what happened afterwards. And that is if they kept doing more and more of these trials. So here they're doing another 100 trials, right? Here they're perfect on that first trial. Now they keep doing it, and they get worse and worse, okay? So there are not many things in this world that the more you practice, the worse you get. But this is one of those rare exceptions here, right? Because 0 is no error, but here they keep on reaching, and they get worse and worse. And if you're a participant in this experiment, it's rather frustrating. Well, how do you think about that? And the way we talk about it, and they were really suggesting this too, is that you can think of this as a stubborn cerebellum, okay? That this is a real modular system. It operates on that sensory prediction error. So here's the schematic there when I do that first trial. I'm aiming over here. I'm aiming over here because you've told me about the strategy, right? But the cerebellum doesn't seem to know about that. All it knows about is I'm aiming over here. The target appears there. The outcome system says, yeah, I nailed it. But the cerebellum says, no way. I got a 45-degree error. And it does its standard learning process. And that's what drives you in this direction here. So here we have this sort of unveiling of this very modular kind of automatic system that seems to be inaccessible to cognition. It's just basically going to be taking this planned movement and seeing this difference and making its adjustment. Now you could ask, does this go on forever, right? If the cerebellum's this stupid, if we kept aiming over there, am I eventually going to be like reaching behind my back, all right? So Jordan and I extended this task where instead of doing the 80 trials, so we actually replicate the result here. Here's the first 80 trials. You see that drift, okay, that cerebellar maladaptation. But then actually, if you keep it going for a bit longer, you go for another 200 trials, things turn around, and eventually you reach stable performance there. So that's interesting, right? Because you don't have that many things where you see these non-monotonic learning functions where you go and usually we think about you're reducing error in a continuous way. Here you get worse for a while, and then you get better, so that by the end, you're doing quite well. Of course, if you stop the experiment at that point, you still see this after effect. So that's the data. So how do we model this data? And the idea here is sort of sketched here is that you've presented the system with a problem, right? When you're doing these strategy trials, you have, here's the target, right? So that's your goal. Here's where you're aiming, right? Because that's what you've told the person to do and they're obedient. They always aim over there. After, say, this point here, after about 60 trials or so, you think you're aiming here. Your hand, because of that adaptation process, is going over here. And now the cursor's off by, say, about 15 or 20 degrees. Well, you've got two different error signals, right? You've got one error signal, which is basically this sensory prediction error, the difference between where I'm aiming and where the dot occurred. And that's what the cerebellum cares about. But I have a different error signal here. I also like to succeed at my task. You know, they told me hit the target. That's what I want to do. And that's this difference. We have this difference between where the goal was and where the cursor is. And so basically, we developed this computational model that basically says that what we see in this non-monotonic function here is this parallel interaction of these two, and I'd even say two independent processes. We have the adaptation system, which is basically saying, did my movement go as expected? I expected to go there. No, it learns with a sensory prediction error. I have this strategy update system, which says, do I have a good sense of what it means to move 45 degrees away from the target? Did I really select the right action? And basically, it's learning with this goal error. And basically, what the model does is it simply has this notion that basically both of these error correction systems, if you looked at these data, you might think that for a while I have the adaptation system, I realize it's maladaptive, and I shut it off and recalibrate my strategy. But what the modeling work suggests is that actually both of these systems are always operating from the very first trial. What changes is that you get this reversal because early on there's no goal error on the first trial. There's just a giant sensory prediction error. But over time, the goal error is rising as the sensory prediction error is dropping. And so the system actually reaches this stable state, which is what you're getting at this point here. It doesn't mean that the cerebellar system is turned off. We can't figure out a way to turn off that system. The system just reached this dynamical state where it's in balance. But the adaptation system is chugging along. And one piece of evidence in favor of that is the notion that what you see here is that the after effect is actually larger than the maximum point of drift, suggesting that, again, the adaptation is continuing even though the other system is redirecting the hand. So this dynamics leads to this asymptotic performance. Just briefly to mention, in terms of having these two systems and that they seem to be involved with different neural systems, this is just a double dissociation between two different patient groups. One, so it's this strategy task. We don't do it for a long enough time, wish we had, to see this reversal played out better. But this is the performance of people with cerebellar degeneration compared to their controls. This is the performance of patients with prefrontal damage. Again, if that drift phenomena, this getting worse with practice, is associated with this, use of the sensory prediction error system, even when it's maladaptive, then here's a case where the patients should perform better than the controls. And indeed, that's what they do. The controls show that characteristic drift pattern. It's there, but to an attenuated degree in the people with cerebellar degeneration. In contrast, the patients with the prefrontal cortex, they actually show this hyperdrift effect. They too seem to be leveling out, but they're level out at a higher point than their controls. And the idea here is that presumably, maybe, or at least we'd infer, that this prefrontal damage is affecting that strategy adjustment system, the system that cares about whether I'm doing my goal correctly or not. And so it's basically the cerebellum run amok in these cases, right? That system's still intact, and so it's operating, it's not checked to the same degree. Okay, so just a quick summary, at least for this stage, we could think about that we have this interaction of two different systems. We have some system, again, we're saying prefrontal cortex, but I doubt it's just the prefrontal cortex. The basal ganglia maybe has to come into the picture. A lot of systems may have to come into the picture. This is all we've looked at so far. But this system, the main point I want to emphasize is that these two systems are both there. They're emphasizing different aspects of task performance, and they're learning through these two very distinct error signals. One cares about the goal. One cares about, did I do the movement properly? Now, if I think about more traditional adaptation tasks, right? So here's kind of, the typical learning function we see, right? Where we don't see this non-monotonicity. We see introduce some error, or you're starting to learn to play basketball. We usually see a monotonic function, right? It flattens out over time. But we've always known that, the performance changes there likely reflect multiple different processes. And there have been different ways that people have tried to characterize the different components or different operations that underlie, say, what we can observe. So here's one sort of notion. It's building off what Marie Smith had talked about, that you might think that there's some component that learns in a slow, gradual, incremental manner. There might be other processes that get you out the door really quickly, like that cognitive stage that Posner and Fitz talked about, that maybe is important early in practice and then levels out. And again, there's lots of debates in the literature about how to characterize different learning processes. Is it just time differences, but the same system operating at different time scales? Is it a difference between implicit and explicit, or what we've talked about, error-driven versus strategic? I mean, there's probably a lot of different dimensions we could talk about these processes. But in almost all of these experiments, these different processes are always convergent. That is, if I'm doing my adaptation task here, and I'm reaching for this target, both the adaptation process is going to drive the hand to bring the cursor to align with the target, but any strategic change, if I choose to aim off to the side, I have the same thing. And so that's made it always difficult to sort of separate the different processes, because usually the performance measures are confounded. They're all pointing to the same direction. So I'll just show you some new work that Ryan Moorhead's put together here, where he basically said, well, we have this evidence that the cerebellum kind of operates in this automatic way. It seems to be immune to the strategic system. You can't really access it. So he said, well, let's just strip down the whole task. So basically what he has people do, it's a very dumb experiment, okay? They see a target, and they reach to the target. That's all they have to do, is they reach to the target. So first I'll show you a movie. This isn't what they really do, but first, just to show you behavior if you do that. So basically, they can't see their hand. I'm just showing you a depiction of the trajectories across, say, 20 seconds of movements here. You can see it just gives you a sense of the variability. This person's got a little bit of a bias to reach off to the left there. So here's the experiment he does, though. He tells them, you're going to do this, reach to the target just like you did before. When you reach, there's going to be what we call a visual error clamp. That is, no matter where you reach, you're going to get the exact same feedback every time. So no matter, you can reach to the right, you can reach down, you can reach straight ahead. We want you to reach to the target. But no matter what you do, you're going to see this cursor that's going to basically follow the exact same trajectory. It's got nothing to do with your motion. You should ignore it. But of course, people can't ignore it. This is the behavior of one person. So the gray is what they actually see. That's the error clamp. The black is their hand. So you can see the gray's the same on every single trial. They're just trying to reach to the target. If you ask them about it, they think they're reaching to the target, but they show this striking adaptation. Okay? So again, this is this idea that now we've taken out the task performance entirely from the experiment. And the idea was that now you could sort of unveil that cerebellar adaptation system in complete isolation, and then we can ask questions about the properties of that system. So again, this is just another example where we have the clamp feedback at 7.5 degrees, right? This is just, again, showing across a series of trials. Here's where that clamp is at 7.5 degrees, but this is the person's performance. Of course, they adapt further than the clamp because they never change the feedback. The feedback stays at 7.5 degrees forever and ever. And again, it's this idea that we have this sensory prediction error. They're trying to go there. The cerebellum's too stupid to know that this is feedback is independent of their action. Isn't independent. It is temporally correlated. And that drives the system. So that's the group data for a 7.5 degree clamp. We can also do it, though, at 15 degrees, and you get this function here, 30 degrees, 45 degrees, 60 degrees, starts to fall off a little bit at 90 degrees. If we finally have the person, they reach here, and the feedback always goes down here, now you break it, okay? But all the way up to 90 degrees, I reach straight ahead, I see this cursor shoot off to the right, left. I know that that cursor has nothing to do with my behavior, and yet you see this effect here. And in more recent work, we've gone to a 1.5 degree clamp. So 1.5 degree clamp, the target lands inside the circle, just on the left edge. You get the same function pretty much there. All right, it does seem to be very similar to adaptation. It's a weird display, but it looks, smells, feels just like adaptation. For instance, people with cerebellar degeneration, again, is sort of a test of that. Here's the normal clamp behavior you see with a 45 degree clamp and age-matched controls. Here's what you see in the people with cerebellar degeneration. They, again, are susceptible to the clamp, but to an attenuated degree. Well, what's interesting then about this clamp is that here's our standard error-based models that have been around in the literature and still are around in the literature. And the basic idea here is that I have some sort of internal model of how I manipulate the tool, how I control my arm, etc. When I do a movement, I'm going to get some feedback and I'm going to update, right? That's what we talked about. The sensory prediction error is used to update my internal model. And the general updating rule is that, I take my old memory, I don't forget it, right? I have my old memory from the previous trial. I have some memory term, and that's usually like 0.995 if you do model fitting and so forth. So I have a pretty good memory of my last state, not perfect. But I'm going to get some sort of error, and I'm going to correct for that error. But we don't want to correct for the whole error because that would make a really unstable oscillating system. If every time I was slightly off, I fully corrected for it, it's an unstable system. So we've always assumed that you only update for part of that error, like numbers like 0.2 are commonly obtained when people model. I correct maybe for 20% of the error. But in all those models, we assume that this learning is proportional, right? But the clamp data say, and indeed, sorry, just to point here, that's what these sorts of effects say, right? If I have an adaptation at 15 degrees or 30 or 60 or 90, this is some data from Taylor and Bond, you see this learning functions kind of stack on top of each other, presumably because of this proportionality rule has been sort of the interpretation. But the clamp data suggests that no, if we actually isolate the adaptation system itself, that really the learning is independent of the error size. And that's sort of one interesting result, I think, that comes out of this, that this proportionality seems to be violated, but also that adaptation doesn't get you all that far. It only gets you about 15 degrees. So even with a 45-degree clamp, if we look at adaptation itself in this isolated manner, you're actually only correcting for about 1/3 of that error. And so where's the rest of it coming from? And again, this is actually from a separate experiment, separate data set here. But Bond and Taylor have reported that if they actually did this experiment and they gave some instructions that basically got people to stop aiming, that everything disappeared. And so the idea here is that the adaptation system has this fairly rigid characteristic. You can't turn it off, but it operates maybe, I don't know if I'd call it a quantal manner, but it doesn't operate in this proportional manner. And the dose dependency you get is probably due to some other learning process, that it probably isn't this form of learning that is the way to characterize the adaptation system. All right, so let me just give a quick summary of that part, right? It's this notion about focusing on this system interaction in the sensory motor learning world. The idea that we really have this operation of multiple processes. I've really just talked about 2 here today, but others have talked about other sorts of learning processes involved, even in a simple task like adaptation. I've emphasized this distinction between a strategic process and adaptation, that they really reflect very different computational goals, right? The strategy cares about, am I doing what I'm supposed to do? The CRBLM doesn't care about that. It just cares about, you've told me what to do, I'm going to do it, right? It seems to be this encapsulated system that, again, from these error clamp results, suggests that you have this automatic response to SPE. All right, so now let me switch gear and flip things around, okay? So that first part really talked about this influence of action selection. One strategies could be thought about as a selection process, how they might impact sensory motor learning. What about the reverse? Is there an influence of sensory motor control on action selection? And the idea I'm going to try to develop here is that, that these could be quite useful tools. And here's my demonstration. So I don't know if at McGill there's as much discussion about reinforcement learning as there is about Berkeley, but it's definitely been a very popular topic in the last 5-10 years. And the basic idea is that, at any point in time, I'm generating some expectation of how good something's going to be. And I'm going to update my value of that object based on whether the outcome is better or worse than I expect. So I have not had glacial water before. My French is a little weak on that one there. But I've heard it's so-so, and actually that is really good water. So there's a case where I have a positive reward prediction error, and the model would say that now, the next time I run into this smart water, I'm going to be a little smarter and say that's really good water, right? But the reverse could have happened. I could have said, I think smart water, I've heard it's really good, right? Good marketing. They chose a good name here. Oh, that's really bitter water, right? And then presumably I have a negative prediction error, and I say, I've generated this expectation, I took my sip, violation there, it wasn't really very tasty, so now I'm gonna down-regulate my value of smart water, right? But now, I could have had this happen. I'll put a cap on here to make it clear, right? Oh, smart water, I think that's really good stuff. I'm gonna have a sip of that, and I knock it over, right? So when I knock it over, well, I've got a negative prediction error, right? Because I was expecting to have a nice, tasty sip of water, but I didn't get one, okay? So, by those models, I had this expectancy, I didn't get rewarded. I should now say, smart water, that's really bad water, right? But that seems ludicrous, that I should punish the water for my clumsiness, right? So that's the question, right? It seems like it's obvious. You say, come on, Rich, you didn't get your sip of water. Don't take it on the water bottle. But we need to have a neurobiological mechanism for how we do what we call a credit assignment problem. And that's the idea that we've been studying lately, is to say, could these sensory prediction errors basically provide a mechanism to solve this credit assignment problem, right? I have to decide, was my negative prediction error because of something property of the water bottle, or is it a property of my motor system? How do I distinguish between, is it a problem in bad action selection or bad action execution? So to look at that, we've gone back to like a simplest of decision-making tasks, okay? The two-armed bandit tasks that people have used in these decision literature, slot machine type behavior. So on each trial, again, the classic task is I have a target on the left, a target on the right. Person presses a button to choose which one they want. They have, they're going to get feedback here. If they choose a button and it's a so-called hit trial, they see a little points here that tell them they earned 42 points on that trial. And at the end of the experiment, they can trade in their points for some money. However, in addition to this payoff, varying the payoff, so that's what I'm showing here. For the green target, it's just going to vary over time, okay? We also vary the probability. And then we tell them, on some trials, you're going to press the button, and it's going to be broken, okay? And you're going to get 0 points. And you're going to know you got 0 points because it's going to turn yellow, and you're not going to see any reward there, okay? And we actually co-vary the two so that when the payoff's high, when I can earn 100 points, the payoff is very low. When the payoff's low, the hit probability is very high. We actually have two functions here. We have the one associated for the green target, one associated for the purple target, and so forth. In this experiment, we decided we don't really need to have any bias in there, so we actually make them perfectly negatively correlated, okay? So in truth, there's really no difference in terms of your expected payoff between choosing one or the other. You could be completely random if you wanted to. If you're rational, you'd show no bias, or you might even behave in a random manner. You'd get the right payoff there. But we know from a long history of decision making that people are really risk averse, okay? And you can think about that. This is sort of showing over time what's happening with this object that's in general less risky. This is the one that's higher risk. Blue is showing the behavior. And so the main point to take away from this slide is that people really track the low risk object. It switches from the one on the left to this one on the right over time. But that's just, this is well known. People have found this before. People are risk averse. To me, it's shocking how risk averse people are. That is, you have these college students who are willing to take, basically, they want 2 cents with a 90% probability rather than the chance to win 85 cents with a much lower probability. They want to suck up those pennies one after another, okay? Dramatically risk averse. All right. Now, here's where we bring the action errors into the picture. We do the exact same experiment, okay? But now we simply tell them, instead of pressing 2 buttons, you have to reach to hit the target, okay? You reach to hit the target with either your, so reach to the left, reach to the right. We're not going to actually show you where your arm is. It's kind of a difficult control problem. We frame it as, but you're going to see a little white cursor, like our sensory prediction error in the adaptation studies, indicating your hand position. So if it's a hit trial, you're going to see the little white dot land on the target, and you're going to get your points. If it's a mistrial, you're going to see the little white dot. It's either going to be above or below the target. Okay, and we actually correlate it with our movement errors to make it very believable. That is, if we want it to be a mistrial, because again, we're controlling the payoff probability. If they reach and they hit the target, but we want it to be a mistrial, we simply take their endpoint and move it out a little bit until it's outside the target. If we want it to be a hit trial, we take their endpoint and we move it in. So we keep some correlation between the two there. When you do this version of the experiment, and the behavior completely changes, okay? Again, here's if you're following the low-risk one. Now they completely follow the high-risk object, okay? So we completely abolish risk aversion in this case. Now, I don't know if you call it, at first, superficially, you call this risk-seeking. But the idea we've been pursuing is that to think of this as basically they're discounting execution errors. It's back to my situation here, right, that when I knock it over, I want to attribute it to my motor system, not to the object itself. And that's the idea that's happening here. Now, and this just shows the two groups together. This is a way to summarize their bias. So 50% no bias, negative or below 50% is risk averse, above is risk seeking. And this is just showing, again, here's the keyboard case, here's the average in terms of the reaching case, and this is actually the tracking behavior, which you can see really separates the two. Now, in our experiment to this point, I'll just talk quickly about a few controls to address this. We've really confounded response and feedback, right? Because not only one case you're key pressing, the other case you're reaching, but in one case you're getting this binary feedback, yes or no, you hit the target. And the other one, we're giving you this dot that tells you how far you missed it from. So we have added this other condition. We call it binary condition. Okay, it's similar to the kinds of things David's been using lately. You reach, but now you're only going to get binary feedback. It's going to show you the number. It's going to turn green if it's a hit. It's just going to turn yellow if it's a miss. So now you have the reach in there, but you don't have at least the visual sensory prediction error. Oh, that jumped through there. And now you see, you can look at this and say, oh, the behavior shows no bias. The way I look at this, those say maybe it's, glasses half full, whatever, not glasses, metaphors, but bottles half full, is that you still, in the reaching case, you still have this dramatic reduction in the risk aversion there. So people are still, and I'd say, discounting the action errors there, the errors there, by attributing it to the motor system. And it may be that you still have some sensory prediction error here. It's just based on a much weaker signal. You don't have that salient visual signal, but you perhaps attribute it to a proprioceptive signal here. Now, we also have, though, another confound, which is that when we do the key press case, we told them sometimes the key is going to be broken, whereas in the reaching case, we told them, the outcome depends on how well you control this thing. So we added a control group here. So this is what we've tested, right? With the keyboard, you don't have control. Sometimes the keyboards break. In the reaching case, you're in control, okay? So that's the one we've had. You can see it's diagonal here. It means it's confounded. So we fill in these two other cells. In the keyboard case, we say how you press that keyboard determines whether you get the reward or not. Now, who knows what the hell they do. They sit there, they tell us they press it hard, they kind of press the side of the key. It really has nothing to do with their behavior, but they at least, I think, believe us. They just never solve the problem. But in the reach case, we add a condition where we tell them where that dot appears has nothing to do with what you're doing, okay? You're reaching, all it's going to tell you is did it hit or not. You're completely out of control. But at least in this experiment here, it had no effect on behavior, okay? So it seems to be having the presence of that little white dot. Doesn't seem to matter whether you think you're in control of the white dot or not. Just the mere presence of the white dot seems to be able to break this risk aversion here. So this is sort of the idea, right? So we've had the standard reinforcement learning model. It says you choose an action, you get an outcome, you use that to update your estimated value. So that's sort of your classic reinforcement learning model. And the part that we're just adding here is that to solve this credit assignment problem, and again, if we're doing button pressing experiments or classic sort of decision making, we don't have action errors. But in the real world, I think we do have action errors all the time. We have to make this decision about, was it my selection? I mean, I like the example of the osprey that's flying above and then diving down for the fish, right? My observations of the ospreys is that they have a hit rate of about 10% at best. And they got to decide, did they not dive right, or did they hallucinate that there was a fish there? So there is the problem, I think, to be solved. And the idea is that here's just showing that there's two different ways. If we thought that the action error, right, this if we think that this sensory prediction error is a signature of an execution error, well, it could be gating the reward prediction error signal. It could be like inhibiting that. That is, when I have a negative prediction error, if I also have a sensory prediction error, I turn down that signal. Or it could be that this system continues to operate like it always does, but the sensory prediction error blocks the updating of the value. It says, that was my bad, don't worry about that one, and so forth. So these are two alternative ways to think about it. I don't really have much, I mean, I welcome your comments here. This is basically about as far as we've gotten on the modeling front. It does, the credit assignment model does outperform either your basic reinforcement learning model or the way people have typically dealt with risk aversion is what they've called subjective utility models. And they work in some cases. They certainly can improve things in the keyboard case, but this credit assignment model does a much better job, and the subjective utility model can't, at least in its current form, account for why people look like they become risk-seeking, whereas the credit assignment model can. One interesting thing, though, about the parameter fit says that we have different learning rates, different updating properties, basically on whether it was a hit trial or a missed trial. That's the essence of this credit assignment model. And it basically says that if I get a reward, I value that in the same way regardless of what condition I'm in. If I get a reward, I like it the same no matter how I got to it. But the parameter that really values is how much do I care about the misses. In the keyboard, when I get a miss, I really care about it. I hate broken buttons, okay? I hate that Coke machine stealing my dollar, okay? But in the execution world, well, you know, no problem. We discount those errors, and that's what's reflected by this very low weight given to that alpha miss. All right, now, if this really is, and this is really open question, this is really speculation, but if it's, because there's different ways to think about how action errors could modulate choices here, but the one idea that we've been thinking about here is that, you know, again, we have the sensory prediction error that we know the motor system's automatically generating, can't get rid of it. And it could be providing that. And certainly there's been a lot of work, and this really inspired a lot of the studies, showing that there are these unexpected or described projections from the cerebellum to the basal ganglia or to dopamine neurons themselves. That is, the output of the cerebellum has projections onto dopaminergic neurons. We also know lots of discussion about cerebellar prefrontal projections. And so, part of the interest here is to ask, well, could this provide some insight into how we think about these cerebellar contributions to non-motor functions? Now, if that's true, we should see that this risk-seeking-like behavior or this attenuation of risk aversion should be attenuated in people with cerebellar degeneration. And that's what you see here. So here's their matched controls. Again, we're just showing you the keyboard data and the reaching data. And you see that you get that risk averse in keyboards, risk-seeking-like or attenuated risk aversion in the reach case. That's the tracking. The people with cerebellar degeneration basically are always risk averse. And again, I do want to emphasize there's other ways to think about that. If you have ataxia, you may not want to reach to difficult things, but at least it's consistent with this idea that no, if I don't have a cerebellum, I can't generate strong sensory prediction errors, so now I don't have a way to actually do that attribution problem. And so they basically continue to be risk averse because they're always getting that negative prediction error. All right, so just really briefly sum up. Right, so basically I've tried to talk about this influence, sort of two sides, right? This notion about how these systems interact. And one part was really about this influence of cognition, so the direction of cognition onto sensory motor learning, and using that to think about how we can describe constraints on cerebellar processing, right? The discussion about that both in the strategy task and in the error clamp, we really see that this is this encapsulated system, okay? And, maybe that's a good thing, right? That you have this, once you've made your choice and you commit to an action, you want to let the action system, I mean, this after the fact I can say this, you want to hand things off to the execution system and say, do your work, get yourself perfectly calibrated, and the cerebellum doesn't have to sit there and think about, was it the right action or not? My job solely is I've got my marching orders, let me do them as well as I can. And this clamp work sort of sent us to the drawing board to try to think about how do we revise our models of how that updating process works, given that we seem to have lost this proportional learning and that we have this limited extent over which it operates. And the second part, though, is trying to flip that around and say, look, we know we have these, or we think we have a good handle on how the cerebellum works in terms of using these sensory prediction errors to keep the motor system well calibrated, to keep the sensory motor system well calibrated. And the idea is, well, if that signal is sitting there, then maybe the brain, through evolutionary processes, has decided I can exploit that, right? Rather than just use that system for this one purpose, it actually serves another very useful purpose. That is, it can be signaling execution errors, which solves a problem that the decision-making system had to solve. Is that it had to solve that credit assignment problem to know, is it an execution error or a selection one? And the idea is, well, for free, that might be something that I get out of this exploitation of the sensory prediction error. And, oh yeah, and that's we're going to move into the developmental direction here, where babies have to try to solve this problem all the time here. I don't know if that's an execution or clearly has the right selection there. So thank you.